Welcome back to Yawn and Gone. Today we explore the life of a peasant in the medieval times. The story begins. Chapter 1: Dawn in the Village. The first light of dawn in a medieval village was not a sudden blaze, but a slow seep of gray and gold across the thatched roofs and worn cobblestones. The air was often cool, damp with the lingering breath of the night, and heavy with the smell of earth, smoke, and livestock. The peasants who stirred at this hour did so not from luxury, but from necessity. There was work to be done, and in the Middle Ages, work was as constant as the turning of the seasons. For the vast majority of people, more than 9 in every 10, life began with the demands of the land, and the land was never patient. Long before the sun cleared the horizon, the first sounds emerged. A cock crowed somewhere behind the timbered walls of a byre. A dog barked at shadows it could not see. Somewhere nearby, the slow, hollow toll of the church bell called the faithful to their morning prayers, though for many peasants, those prayers would have to be whispered between chores. A medieval peasant's dwelling was a modest affair, a single room, perhaps 2 if the family was fortunate, with walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof, thick with thatch, held the scent of years of smoke and rain. Inside, the floor was little more than hardened earth, sometimes strewn with reeds or rushes to soften the step. In the faint light, shapes took form: a rough-hewn table, a few stools, a chest for storing what little the family possessed, and a hearth whose coals had smoldered through the night. It was at that hearth that the day began. One member of the household, often the mother or the eldest child, would crouch low, coaxing the embers back to life with careful breaths and dry kindling. The crackle of the rekindled fire was both comfort and necessity, for it would heat the morning meal and warm the home before the family stepped out into the chill. Breakfast was no feast. A thick slice of coarse bread, perhaps dipped in pottage, a watery stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever scraps could be spared from the night before. If the household kept a cow or a few goats, there might be a mug of milk, fresh if the animal had been milked at first light. Meat was rare, kept for feasts, market days, or the occasional slaughter when an animal could no longer work or produce. Outside, the village slowly came to life. From one cottage, a man emerged carrying a wooden bucket toward the communal well, its stones slick with moss. From another, 2 children scurried to chase a wayward chicken back toward its coop. Across the muddy track that served as the main road, an elderly woman stooped to gather kindling, her back bent from decades of labor in the fields. The smells of the morning were a tapestry in themselves: wood smoke drifting from low chimneys, the damp scent of freshly turned soil from the previous day's plowing, the tang of manure from the byre and the pigsty. To modern noses, it might seem overwhelming, but to those who lived here, it was simply the scent of life. Work began early because daylight was precious. In winter, when the sun lingered low and the days were short, every moment of light was used for labor. In summer, the long hours of sun meant equally long hours of toil, though the warmth and light made the work a little less harsh. The men of the household often went first to the fields, to check the condition of the crops, to repair fences, or to begin the day's plowing if the season demanded it. Their plows were simple wooden frames, often tipped with an iron blade if the village was wealthy enough, and pulled by oxen or, more rarely, by horses. The earth was stubborn, and the work was slow. Women's labor was no less demanding. Aside from tending the fire and preparing meals, they might carry water, care for animals, spin wool, or weave cloth. In harvest season, they joined the men in the fields, scything and binding sheaves under the open sky. Even children were not idle. By the age of 6 or 7, most were tasked with simple but essential duties: minding younger siblings, scaring birds from the grain fields, or helping to gather eggs and milk. The village itself was a cluster of life surrounded by a vast web of obligations. Most peasants did not own the land they worked. Instead, it belonged to a lord, whose manor dominated the local hierarchy. The peasants were bound to this land, owing rent in the form of crops, labor, or coin. The manor's steward kept careful records, and failure to meet these obligations could mean fines, punishment, or even the loss of the small plot that sustained the family. But at dawn, before the weight of these duties fully descended, there was a moment, brief, almost invisible, where the village simply existed in peace. A thin mist might cling to the fields, the sound of distant cattle bells carrying through the still air. The church stood as a silent sentinel, its spire pointing toward heaven, its walls holding centuries of baptisms, marriages, and burials. In that quiet, the medieval village was more than just a place of hardship. It was a home, fragile, weathered, and imperfect, yet bound together by the shared rhythms of life. Here, every dawn was a promise and a burden, a reminder that survival was earned one day at a time. As the eastern horizon began to glow a muted gold, the narrow paths between cottages grew busier. Wooden doors creaked on their hinges, and the faint murmur of voices drifted into the open air. The first true light of the sun revealed the details that the twilight had kept hidden: the uneven lines of thatched roofs, the weathered timbers blackened by years of rain and smoke, and the crooked wooden fences that marked the edges of tiny garden plots. These gardens were lifelines. Even the poorest families tried to keep a small patch of earth tilled for vegetables and herbs, onions, leeks, beans, cabbages, and perhaps a row or two of medicinal plants such as parsley, sage, or marigold. The soil was often tired from overuse, for manure and compost were in short supply, and the growing season had to be wrestled from the land rather than coaxed from it. Still, the sight of green shoots was a comfort, a promise of food in the months ahead. Beyond the village's edge, the open fields stretched in a patchwork of different crops. In many medieval communities, the land was divided into long strips under the open field system. Each family's holdings were scattered among the fields rather than grouped together, a practice that ensured both the sharing of good soil and the burden of poor soil. These strips were narrow, often only a few yards wide, and separated by ridges or low banks. Peasants walked to their allotted strips in the pale morning light, carrying tools whose handles were worn smooth by the hands of fathers and grandfathers before them. The soundscape of a medieval morning was a living thing. The deep, rhythmic thud of an axe echoed from the edge of the woodland where a man split logs for the day's fuel. The sharp ring of a blacksmith's hammer sounded from his small forge near the manor road. The bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle mingled with the clatter of wooden pails against stone as water was drawn from the well. There were no idle sounds here. Every noise was the mark of work being done. Inside the cottages, the first meal of the day was eaten without ceremony. The bread was dense, made from barley, rye, or oats more often than wheat, for wheat was costly and in short supply. Sometimes a piece of hard cheese was cut with care, its surface tinged with the faint bloom of age. On rare mornings, especially in summer, there might be a handful of fresh berries gathered by the children the day before. Meals were never hurried, but they were not lingered over either. Time was a resource as precious as any coin. Once fed, the day's work began in earnest. Men and boys might shoulder hoes or scythes, heading for the fields. Women would tend to the livestock, milking goats or cows, feeding chickens, mucking out stalls. If a family kept pigs, they would be driven out to forage in the forest, their sharp snouts rooting through the undergrowth for acorns and fallen fruit. Children too small for heavy labor found their own roles, carrying messages between neighbors, gathering kindling, or keeping a watchful eye for the Lord's bailiff, whose arrival might mean the collection of dues or the announcement of new obligations. The bailiff was a figure of both authority and wariness. Acting on behalf of the Lord, he ensured that rents were paid, labor services fulfilled, and justice administered according to the manor's customs. A visit from the bailiff could bring news, sometimes welcome, often not, and peasants learned to read his face as carefully as they might read the weather. And the weather, more than any lord or law, ruled peasant life. A clear sky at dawn might bring hope, but it could turn quickly to rain, threatening to spoil a hay harvest or flood a freshly seeded field. A sudden frost in late spring could kill tender shoots, meaning hunger months later when the stores ran dry. Peasants were keen observers of the natural world, reading signs in the flight of birds, the shapes of clouds, or the color of the dawn light itself. Despite the long hours of work, the village was not without its moments of shared life and conversation. As men worked side by side in the fields, they spoke of the weather, of the Lord's demands, of small happenings in neighboring hamlets. Women gathering water might pause to exchange news, a birth, a death, or a rumor brought by a passing peddler. These small threads of talk wove the social fabric of the village, binding it together through the shared burden of survival. Religious life was ever present, even if not always at the forefront of a peasant's thoughts. The church bell marked the hours of prayer, and though many could not attend every service, the rhythm of the liturgical days still shaped the hours. On Sundays and feast days, work was set aside for Mass, the villagers gathering in their best garments, simple tunics newly washed, or a woolen cloak brushed free of mud. The priest, often one of the few literate men in the area, was a figure of spiritual authority but also of practical importance, mediating disputes and advising on matters of health and morality. As the morning deepened toward midday, the village settled into its steady hum of labor. Fields were tilled, fences mended, animals tended. Smoke rose in thin columns from cooking fires as women prepared the day's main meal, often a thicker pottage with whatever vegetables were in season. In the summer months, this was eaten outdoors when possible, with children running underfoot and dogs lingering in hope of scraps. In winter, the meal was eaten huddled close to the fire, the walls of the cottage blocking the cold wind. In every season, the work of a medieval peasant began with the dawn, and would not truly end until darkness forced it to. Yet within that cycle, the early hours had their own quiet dignity. Dawn was the threshold between rest and labor, a moment when the village breathed together before scattering into the day's demands. Even in a life defined by hardship, there was something almost sacred in that moment when the first light touched the fields, when the mist lifted, and when the land revealed itself once again as both a taskmaster and a provider. Chapter 2: The Village and its Surroundings. The village did not exist in isolation. It was a small knot of life amid the wider expanse of cultivated fields, meadows, and woods. From the center of the settlement, one could see the patchwork of long strips of farmland stretching toward the horizon. These fields were divided among the peasants according to tradition and obligation, their edges marked by low earth banks, hedgerows, or simple stone walls. The arrangement might appear chaotic to an outsider, but every strip had its owner, and every owner knew the boundaries by heart. Paths leading out of the village were narrow, muddy, and well-worn, reflecting the rhythm of daily life. Foot traffic was constant. Men, women, and children moved along these routes carrying water, firewood, and tools. Occasionally, the paths widened near the village's edge to accommodate carts, oxen, or the rare horse bringing supplies or messages. Every track bore the imprint of hundreds of feet over generations, a living record of the village's history. Surrounding the cultivated fields were areas of woodland, common pasture, and sometimes marsh. These lands were vital to the villagers' survival. The woods provided timber for repairs, firewood for warmth, and wild fruits, nuts, and herbs that supplemented the meager diet. Common pastures offered grazing for pigs, cows, and sheep, and villagers shared the responsibility of managing them under customary rules. These shared resources were both a necessity and a source of tension, as every family relied on them, yet overuse could lead to disputes or diminished yields. Water, always precious, shaped the layout of the village. Many settlements grew near streams, brooks, or shallow rivers. These water sources were vital for drinking, cooking, and tending animals. Some villages dug wells to supplement natural streams, but maintaining them was a constant task, especially when the soil shifted or the well walls began to crumble. At dawn, children and women carried buckets along the slippery paths to draw water, balancing them carefully to avoid spillage. The sound of clinking pails against stone punctuated the quiet of the early hours. At the edge of the village, the manor house or lord's residence stood as a reminder of authority. Its walls were taller, its roofs more refined, and its gates more imposing than any peasant cottage. From here, the lord's steward or bailiff managed the village's obligations, overseeing the collection of rents, tithes, and labor. While the villagers worked their plots, the manor oversaw the flow of resources, grain, animals, and manpower, that sustained both the lord's wealth and the village's survival. The landscape itself was never still. Fields shifted with the seasons, hedgerows grew or were cut back, and rivers changed their courses slightly with each winter flood. Villagers learned to read these changes as carefully as they read the weather. A muddy bank meant waterlogging that could drown seedlings. A fallen branch in the forest might signal both an opportunity for firewood and a potential hazard. Everything in the surroundings required attention, and the eye of a peasant was trained to notice detail, for small oversights could have lasting consequences. Daily life in the village also depended on mobility. Peasants traveled to neighboring villages, markets, or the manor house to fulfill duties, sell surplus goods, or gather information. These journeys were measured and cautious. Roads were often little more than dirt tracks, prone to flooding and treacherous after rain. Travelers needed to carry food, water, and perhaps a tool for defense against wild animals or highwaymen. Yet these trips brought the world beyond the village into perspective. Stories of distant harvests, news of war or plague, and rumors of prices at town markets shaped decisions in homes far removed from the bustle of urban life. At dawn, the sounds of the surrounding lands were layered and persistent. Birds called from the woods, their songs marking the passage of the hours. The distant lowing of cattle on common pastures mixed with the sharper clatter of hooves on village paths. Streams gurgled over stones, and wind whispered through the hedgerows and trees. Even in the quietest moments, the village existed in dialogue with the world around it, a network of interdependent sights and sounds. The edge of the cultivated fields marked a transition. Beyond lay the untamed landscape, forests with dense undergrowth, rivers with sudden drop-offs, and bogs where the earth gave way without warning. Children were taught early to respect these boundaries. Missteps could be fatal, and stories of lost travelers or wild animals served both as caution and as moral lesson. But the untamed lands also offered opportunities. Gathering wild mushrooms, collecting firewood, hunting small game, these activities supplemented the village's resources, providing both sustenance and a measure of freedom within the confines of daily toil. Hedgerows and fences delineated ownership, but they also served as shelters and habitats for wildlife. Rabbits darted along the edges of fields, foxes prowled near the woods, and birds nested in the trees. Villagers understood the rhythms of these creatures, using their presence to gauge the health of the land. A silent morning with few signs of movement could suggest a poor harvest or an approaching storm. An abundance of tracks might indicate a successful season or the need to protect crops from animals. The village itself was organized with remarkable practicality. Houses were clustered together for protection and community. The larger spaces were devoted to common areas such as the well, the church, and perhaps a small marketplace. Livestock were kept near the edge of the settlement to minimize smell and the risk of disease. Paths were not paved, but their careful maintenance was essential. During heavy rains, villagers would reinforce them with stone or packed earth to prevent mud from swallowing a foot or wheel. The natural world, the cultivated land, and the village's structures were interdependent. A failure in one aspect rippled across the others. If the well ran dry, every household suffered. If the forest was overharvested, fuel became scarce and winter nights grew perilous. If the hedgerows were neglected, animals could stray, destroying crops. Survival required constant vigilance and intimate knowledge of the environment. Life in the village and its surroundings was therefore defined by rhythm and routine. Each day had its cadence, set by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of both work and authority. Every peasant was part of a delicate balance, a participant in an ecosystem of effort and consequence. From the first light to the last, the village and its lands required attention, respect, and endurance. Even as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the patchwork of fields and the contours of the surrounding woods, the peasants moved in harmony with their environment. They plowed, they planted, they watered, and they tended, each gesture small, repeated, and vital. Their survival depended on observing the land, understanding its moods, and acting with both care and swiftness. In this way, the village was never merely a collection of cottages or people. It was a living organism, sustained by the interaction of soil, water, plants, animals, and human effort. Every hedgerow, stream, and field played a part in the story of survival. And as the morning unfolded, the village and its surroundings came alive not in grandeur, but in the measured, patient rhythm of life lived close to the earth. Chapter 3: A Peasant's Home. The home of a medieval peasant was modest in every sense, yet it was both shelter and center of life. Most houses consisted of a single room, though a few larger families might manage 2 or 3 spaces. Built from wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks plastered with mud, straw, and sometimes animal dung, the walls bore the marks of years of weather and human care. Thick thatched roofs, layered with reeds or straw, helped keep out rain and cold, though they never fully blocked wind or drafts. Smoke from the hearth escaped through a small opening in the roof or through the door, filling the home with the scent of fire and food. Inside, the floors were bare earth, hardened by constant use. Occasionally, families spread rushes or straw to soften the walking surface and to provide insulation against the chill. Furniture was sparse and utilitarian: a few rough stools, a table carved from a single slab of wood, a chest to hold clothing and tools. Personal possessions were minimal, often limited to a handful of pots, a set of wooden bowls, and the clothing worn by each family member. Every item mattered, and its loss could be a small but significant disaster. The hearth was the heart of the home, a source of warmth, light, and nourishment. Here, fires were kindled early in the morning and maintained until nightfall. The first task upon waking was often to rekindle the embers, coaxing them back to life with dry kindling and gentle breaths. The fire allowed food to be cooked, a simple pottage of grains, vegetables, and sometimes scraps of meat, and provided comfort in the long, dark hours of winter. Sleeping arrangements were equally humble. A straw mattress or pile of rushes provided a bed for the parents, while children often slept on the floor or shared the same space. Blankets were rare, and warmth came primarily from proximity to the hearth and the bodies of other family members. Night brought not only darkness but vulnerability. Thieves, wild animals, and illness were constant threats, and the security offered by the home was fragile at best. Storage was another challenge. With little room, families had to organize carefully. Grain might be stored in sacks or small bins, dried herbs hung from rafters, and tools stacked neatly in corners. Every item had a purpose, and space was a precious commodity. In times of scarcity, the need to ration both space and resources demanded careful thought and planning. The daily rhythm of life within the home was dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. Early morning brought preparation for the day's work: drawing water, tending animals, mending clothing, or gathering tools. Midday often saw a brief meal taken near the hearth, a moment of rest before returning to the fields, the forest, or other tasks. Evening was when the family regrouped, shared what food they had, and exchanged news or stories passed down through generations. Children were integral to the household. Even before they were old enough to work in the fields, they learned the skills necessary for survival. They watched elders spin wool, weave baskets, or repair tools. They carried water from the well, gathered eggs from the chickens, and helped tend the animals. Education was informal and practical, focused on survival and community knowledge rather than books or formal instruction. Hygiene was minimal by modern standards. Bathing was infrequent, and water was often reserved primarily for drinking and cooking. Clothes were washed when necessary, sometimes using lye or ash as a cleaning agent. Living in close quarters with animals meant that dirt, hair, and the scent of livestock were constant companions. Disease spread easily, and villagers became accustomed to discomfort as a daily norm. The walls of a peasant home, though simple, sometimes bore small decorations or personal touches. Herbs might hang from rafters, not only for culinary use but also for fragrance or superstition. Carvings on beams could mark significant events or serve as protective symbols. Such touches were modest but spoke to the human desire to assert identity, even within the confines of necessity. Windows were small, if present at all. Often, homes had narrow slits to let in light while minimizing exposure to the cold. Glass was rare, expensive, and largely confined to the homes of the wealthy. In most cottages, openings were covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. Candles, tallow lamps, or the hearth provided additional illumination in the dim interior. The exterior of the home was just as functional. A small garden might surround the dwelling, containing vegetables, herbs, and flowers. A simple fence kept animals at bay. Beyond that, the home often had a small outbuilding or shed to store tools, firewood, or a few domestic animals. The yard, though modest, was an extension of the living space, used for work, play, and the management of daily tasks. Life within the peasant home was hard but structured. Every day required careful management of limited resources, constant attention to tasks, and cooperation among family members. The home was a place of refuge, yet it offered little comfort beyond what people made for themselves. Despite its hardships, the home was also a place of learning, adaptation, and resilience, a microcosm of the larger world beyond its walls. Seasonal changes transformed the home and its surroundings. Winter brought long nights and the need to conserve fuel. Summer offered longer days but demanded more labor in the fields, leaving little time for rest. Spring and autumn were periods of preparation and harvest, with each day packed full of chores and responsibilities. The family worked as a unit, each member contributing what they could, for survival depended on the collective effort. The home, in its simplicity, was a testament to endurance. Every meal prepared, every fire tended, every patch of clothing repaired represented an ongoing struggle against scarcity, illness, and the harshness of the environment. Yet it was also a space of connection, where bonds were reinforced and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The walls held the sounds of laughter, argument, instruction, and sometimes tears. Within these modest confines, life unfolded in a rhythm as steady and unyielding as the turning of the seasons. Chapter 4: Daily Life and Work in the Fields. From the moment the first light of dawn spilled across the horizon, the peasant's day was governed by the land. Fields stretched outward from the village in long, uneven strips, some tilled, others left fallow according to the rhythm of crop rotation. These strips were often not owned by the peasants themselves but were worked under the rights and restrictions of the local lord. For many, the land they labored upon was both the giver of life and the constant reminder of their lowly position in the feudal hierarchy. The start of the working day came quickly after waking. With little time for leisure, breakfast was often nothing more than a piece of coarse bread, perhaps dipped in ale or accompanied by a small wedge of cheese. Ale was safer to drink than water, which might be drawn from wells shared with both humans and livestock. On special days, perhaps after a slaughter or during festival seasons, meat might be added, but for most mornings, sustenance was basic and functional. The tools of the trade were simple yet essential. Wooden plows with iron tips carved furrows in the earth, drawn by oxen or horses when available. Hoes, sickles, and scythes were kept sharp and ready. Peasants could not afford to waste tools, so repairs were constant. A broken handle might be replaced from the woodlet, a dulled blade sharpened with a whetstone in the early morning mist before work began. Springtime was one of the busiest seasons. Fields needed plowing and sowing. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat were planted in carefully tended strips. The work was repetitive yet demanding, requiring both strength and stamina. Seeds were scattered by hand, a skill passed down through generations to ensure even distribution and healthy growth. The soil was turned with care, and every clump broken to prepare for the fragile green shoots that would soon emerge. Summer brought long days under an unrelenting sun. Weeding became a near daily task, as unwanted plants could quickly choke the life from young crops. Livestock needed tending as well, driven to pasture in the early morning and brought back before nightfall. Children often played a role here, acting as shepherds for sheep or goats, learning responsibility at an age when modern children would still be at play. The hum of insects, the scent of cut grass, and the steady rhythm of scythes sweeping through fields defined the season. Autumn was the season of harvest, the culmination of months of labor. Here, the entire community came together. Men, women, and children all took part in reaping the grain, binding it into sheaves, and carrying it to barns or threshing floors. The pace was urgent. Poor weather could spoil a crop in days. Once gathered, the grain was separated from the chaff, often by flailing or trampling. The air filled with dust, the smell of dry husks, and the sound of tools striking in steady rhythm. The harvest was not entirely the peasants' to keep. A portion was due to the Lord as rent or tax, sometimes a tenth for the church as a tithe, and another share for seed to be sown the next year. What remained would have to last through the long winter. Miscalculations or poor yields meant hunger, sometimes famine. There were no guarantees. Even the hardest worker could find themselves facing an empty storehouse by midwinter if weather, pests, or disease turned against them. Winter changed the pattern of life but did not remove labor. With the fields at rest, peasants turned to repairing tools, mending clothing, and tending animals kept in barns or sheds for warmth. Firewood had to be gathered and stored, and in especially harsh winters, snow had to be cleared from paths to reach the well or the Lord's manor when duty called. The cold made every task slower and more uncomfortable. Yet winter also offered brief moments of respite, a chance to share stories by the hearth, carve new handles for tools, or weave baskets for the year ahead. Work in the fields was physically punishing. Hours were long, and the demands unchanging. Hands became calloused and rough, backs bent from years of labor, joints worn from repetitive motion. Injuries were common, whether from sharp tools, heavy lifting, or accidents involving animals. Medical care was rudimentary at best. A serious injury could mean permanent disability, or even death. The relationship between the peasant and the land was both intimate and fraught. They knew the soil's moods, could read the signs of coming weather in the clouds, and understood which parts of the field yielded best. Yet they had no ultimate control. A single storm, a swarm of locusts, or an outbreak of blight could undo months of effort. Superstitions flourished here. Charms, blessings, and rituals accompanied planting and harvest, in the hope that unseen forces might be swayed toward generosity. Life in the fields was also social in its own way. Neighbors worked side by side, exchanging news, gossip, and sometimes songs to make the hours pass more quickly. Festivals tied to the agricultural calendar marked important transitions, the first sowing, the last harvest, giving the community moments to pause and celebrate, however modestly. Even in hardship, there was camaraderie born of shared labor and shared survival. In many villages, strips of land were scattered rather than consolidated, meaning a peasant's fields might lie far apart, requiring long walks to tend each one. This fragmentation was designed to ensure fairness in the quality of land but also made labor more exhausting. The time spent traveling between plots could eat into hours of productivity, and bad weather could make distant fields nearly inaccessible. The cycle of labor in the medieval countryside was relentless and repetitive, yet it carried a certain stability. Generations before had worked the same land in the same way, and the skills were ingrained from childhood. A boy might learn to handle a plow before his teenage years. A girl might know how to sew and weed with practiced efficiency long before adulthood. In this way, knowledge was preserved and survival ensured, not through written manuals, but through living practice. The rewards of such labor were modest but tangible: bread on the table, ale in the cup, a roof that held against the rain, and perhaps, in a good year, a small surplus that could be traded for something otherwise unattainable. But always, beneath the rhythm of planting and harvest, lay the uncertainty of nature and the demands of the feudal system. The land sustained them, but it also bound them in service, a cycle as unending as the turning of the seasons. Chapter 5: Food and Diet of the Peasant. For the medieval peasant, food was not a matter of choice so much as necessity, dictated by the seasons, the harvest, and the limits of one's resources. Meals were rarely varied, and the concept of a balanced diet was far from reality. Instead, the peasant ate what was available, what could be grown or foraged locally, and what the lord's obligations allowed them to keep. Hunger was an ever-present shadow, particularly in years when crops failed or when taxes and tithes stripped away the best of the yield. Bread was the foundation of the peasant's diet. It was not the soft, refined loaf of modern bakeries but a coarse, dark bread made from rye, barley, oats, or a mix of whatever grain could be spared. Wheat, prized for its fine white flour, was generally reserved for the tables of the wealthy. Grinding the grain into flour was laborious, done by hand in small querns or at a communal mill. The bread was dense and filling, often flavored not with sugar but with the earthy tang of the grain and, sometimes, a hint of sourness from the leavening process. Alongside bread, pottage was a daily staple. This thick, slow-cooked stew was made by boiling grains like oats or barley with vegetables, herbs, and, on rare occasions, bits of meat. The ingredients varied depending on the season: leeks, onions, cabbage, turnips, and carrots in cooler months, peas, beans, and fresh greens in summer. Pottage could be kept simmering over the fire for hours, with new ingredients added as they became available, making it a practical and economical meal. Meat was scarce for most peasants. While they kept animals such as chickens, pigs, and sometimes sheep or goats, these were more valuable for their eggs, milk, or wool than for slaughter. Killing a pig or cow was done only when absolutely necessary, often in late autumn before winter fodder ran short. When meat was eaten, it was often salted, smoked, or cured to extend its lifespan. Game, such as deer or wild boar, was the exclusive right of the lord, and hunting without permission could result in severe punishment, even death. Fish played a more prominent role, particularly in regions near rivers, lakes, or the coast. Fresh fish could be caught and eaten quickly, while salted or dried fish could be stored for weeks. Church rules, which forbade the eating of meat on Fridays and during certain fast periods, made fish an important alternative. Eels, in particular, were a common food, easy to trap and able to survive long out of water, making them convenient for trade and storage. Dairy products provided vital protein and fat. Milk from cows or goats was rarely drunk fresh, as it spoiled quickly. Instead, it was turned into butter, cheese, or curds. Cheese was particularly valuable. Not only could it last much longer than fresh milk, but it was also portable and could be traded for other goods. The cheeses of the peasant table were often strong in flavor, made with minimal equipment, and aged in cool cellars or even earthen pits. Seasonality defined the diet. In spring, fresh greens and herbs such as nettles, sorrel, and parsley were foraged to supplement stored foods. Summer brought berries, cherries, and apples, though fruit was typically consumed fresh before it could spoil. In autumn, the fields and hedgerows provided nuts, late vegetables, and roots to be stored in cellars or buried in pits. Winter was the leanest season, when the diet relied heavily on preserved foods, salted meat, dried peas, and whatever root vegetables remained unspoiled. Ale was the most common drink, brewed at home, or in small village brewhouses. It was often weak in alcohol but safer than untreated water, which could carry disease. For the wealthier peasants, stronger ale or mead might be enjoyed during festivals, but for daily life, small beer, a light, low-alcohol brew, was the standard. Children drank it as readily as adults. Flavorings were modest. Salt was precious and sometimes taxed heavily. Herbs such as sage, thyme, and marjoram were grown in small kitchen gardens, while wild garlic and horseradish were foraged. Imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, or cloves were beyond the reach of ordinary peasants, reserved for the feasts of lords and wealthy merchants. Even honey, though occasionally available, was a luxury, often claimed by the lord as part of his rights over village beekeeping. Feasts and special occasions offered rare opportunities for indulgence. Weddings, religious festivals, and the end of the harvest might see the roasting of a pig, the baking of richer breads, or the brewing of stronger ale. On these days, the community came together, sharing what they could spare in a spirit of collective celebration. Yet such abundance was fleeting, quickly replaced by the return to the usual fare. Hunger shaped the rhythm of life. The hungry gap, the late winter and early spring months when stored food dwindled and the new harvest was still far off, was a period of particular hardship. Families might stretch meals by adding more water to the pottage, foraging for wild plants, or, in desperate times, consuming food normally reserved for animals. Malnutrition was common, weakening the body and making it more vulnerable to disease. Despite these limitations, the peasant's diet was not without merit. It was largely plant-based, rich in fiber, and minimally processed. Those who survived childhood and avoided severe famine could live into middle age with reasonable health, provided the workload and hazards of rural life did not claim them first. But food was always at the heart of their existence, sowing it, tending it, harvesting it, preserving it, and finally eating it in portions dictated by nature's generosity or stinginess. For the medieval peasant, every mouthful was a reminder of their place in the cycle of survival. A bowl of pottage was not simply a meal. It was the result of months of labor, the cooperation of neighbors, and the uncertain blessings of weather and soil. In this way, food was more than sustenance. It was a measure of fortune, both personal and communal, in a world where plenty was fleeting and hunger always close at hand. Chapter 6: Clothing, Shelter, and Domestic Life. In the medieval countryside, the clothing of a peasant was not chosen for style or variety but for function, durability, and the harsh reality of cost. Every garment had to withstand the wear and tear of daily labor, bending in the fields, hauling firewood, tending animals, and enduring the shifting seasons. Clothes were made to last as long as possible, patched and mended until the fabric was more repair than original weave. Wool was the most common material for outer garments. Sheep were plentiful, and their wool could be spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and dyed with simple, natural pigments. The wool was coarse and often itchy, but it was warm and relatively weather-resistant, essential for those who worked outdoors in wind, rain, and frost. In warmer months, linen garments were preferred when possible, made from the labor-intensive process of retting, breaking, and spinning flax fibers. Linen was softer against the skin and cooler in summer, but it was also more costly to produce, so a single tunic might be worn year after year until threadbare. The basic clothing for a peasant man consisted of a long tunic, belted at the waist, with hose or leggings that might be sewn directly to the tunic or tied on with cords. Over this, in colder weather, a cloak or mantle of wool would be draped, sometimes fastened with a simple brooch or pin of bone, wood, or metal. Footwear, if owned at all, was simple leather shoes or boots, often handmade and resoled repeatedly to prolong their use. Many peasants went barefoot in summer to preserve their shoes for the cold months. Women's clothing was similar in practicality. A long linen shift served as the base layer, over which a kirtle, a long, sleeveless or short-sleeved gown, was worn. In colder weather, a woolen overdress or cloak provided warmth. An apron, often made from sturdy linen, protected the garments beneath during work. Married women and those of respectable standing covered their hair with wimples, veils, or simple cloth head coverings, both for modesty and protection from dirt and sun. Children, who grew quickly, wore hand-me-downs from older siblings or garments made from repurposed adult clothing. It was common to see children dressed in little more than tunics or shifts, without shoes, running barefoot through the village until the frost set in. The idea of owning multiple sets of clothes was a luxury. Most peasants had one best outfit, reserved for church or special occasions, and their everyday work clothes, worn constantly until they could no longer be salvaged. Shelter for the medieval peasant was equally modest. Most lived in simple wattle and daub houses, their walls formed from woven wooden strips coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with layers of reeds or straw, carefully laid to keep out rain. A well-maintained thatch could last a decade or more, but it required regular patching, as wind, birds, and damp could cause decay. These houses were small, often a single room where the family cooked, ate, and slept. Larger or slightly more prosperous households might have a loft for sleeping or a partition to separate people from animals. In many homes, livestock such as chickens or even a pig were brought indoors during the winter to protect them from thieves and cold, their body heat helping to warm the space. The floor was usually packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that were replaced periodically to absorb dirt, moisture, and waste. The central hearth was the heart of the home, the only source of heat and the place where all cooking was done. There was no chimney in most early medieval houses. Instead, smoke from the fire drifted upward and escaped through a hole in the roof or simply seeped out through the thatch. This meant the air inside was often thick and smoky, stinging the eyes and leaving a permanent scent in hair, skin, and clothing. Yet without the fire, there would be no warmth, no hot food, and no light after sunset. Furniture was sparse and handmade. A simple table, benches, and perhaps a wooden chest for storing clothing or tools were the main pieces. Beds, if they could be called such, were wooden frames with rope supports, piled with straw or hay and covered with blankets or animal skins. Many peasants slept communally, parents, children, and sometimes servants or elderly relatives together, both for warmth and because there was simply no space for separate sleeping quarters. Domestic life revolved around survival and self-sufficiency. The peasant's home was not merely a place to rest, but a workshop, a storage space, and a shelter for all the family's essential tasks. Inside, women spun wool or flax into thread, mended clothes, and prepared food, while men repaired tools, fashioned simple furniture, or tended to stored grain and root vegetables. Children assisted in chores from a young age, fetching water, gathering firewood, or minding younger siblings. Cleanliness, by modern standards, was a luxury. Washing clothes required hauling water, heating it over a fire, and using harsh lye soap that could wear down fabric quickly. Bathing was rare, particularly in cold months, though washing hands and face was more common. Water for drinking and cleaning came from wells, streams, or communal village pumps, and had to be carried home in buckets or pitchers, a task that often fell to women and older children. Despite the hardships, the home was a place of familiarity and comfort in its own way. The smell of baking bread or simmering pottage, the low chatter of family around the fire, and the dim glow of rushlights or tallow candles created a sense of warmth in the long winter evenings. Neighbors might gather to share news, lend tools, or help repair a roof, and the bonds of community often extended into the domestic space. A peasant's clothing and home told the story of their life, of thrift and resourcefulness, of enduring the elements with what little could be afforded, and of finding a kind of dignity in simplicity. While the walls might be humble and the garments plain, they were shaped by countless hours of labor, crafted and maintained with care, and adapted to suit a world where every possession had to justify its place. Chapter 7: The Feudal System and Obligations. The medieval village did not exist in isolation. Every peasant, no matter how poor or humble, was part of a vast structure of power and obligation known as the feudal system. This was not simply an abstract idea of government. It was the framework that defined every relationship, every right, and every duty. From the lord in his fortified manor to the lowest serf tilling the soil, all were bound together by a web of service and protection. For the peasant, the system was at once a burden and a lifeline. It dictated what they owed in labor, what portion of their harvest they must surrender, and even what freedoms they were permitted to enjoy. But it also guaranteed, at least in theory, the lord's protection from raiders, bandits, or rival nobles who might otherwise sweep across the land like a storm. When dawn broke over the village fields, the obligations of feudalism were not far behind. The peasants rose not only for themselves, but for their lord. Some days they worked their own strips of farmland, tending to their family's survival. Other days, often the most dreaded, they labored on the domain, the lord's private fields. This was free work owed as part of their tenancy, a duty that could consume several days each week during the busiest seasons. The rhythm of obligation extended beyond farming. Peasants were called upon to repair roads, maintain ditches and hedges, cut timber, or haul stones for the lord's construction projects. If war threatened, they might be summoned to carry supplies, dig trenches, or even follow their lord into battle as camp followers. Each task was a reminder that their lives were not entirely their own. The medieval village did not exist in isolation. Every peasant, no matter how poor or humble, was part of a vast structure of power and obligation known as the feudal system. This was not simply an abstract idea of government. It was the framework that defined every relationship, every right, and every duty. From the lord in his fortified manor to the lowest serf tilling the soil, all were bound together by a web of service and protection. For the peasant, the system was at once a burden and a lifeline. It dictated what they owed in labor, what portion of their harvest they must surrender, and even what freedoms they were permitted to enjoy. But it also guaranteed, at least in theory, the lord's protection from raiders, bandits, or rival nobles who might otherwise sweep across the land like a storm. The web of obligation. At the heart of the system was a simple trade, land for service. Lords granted strips of farmland, cottages, and the right to live within the boundaries of the manor in exchange for unending labor and loyalty. For the vast majority of peasants, especially the unfree serfs, this agreement was not a choice, but a condition of birth. A peasant might be born in a thatched cottage on the edge of a field and spend their entire life within sight of that same cottage. The rights to work that land, to raise livestock, and to feed their family were inseparable from the duties they owed to their lord. They were tenants, but in truth, more like tenants chained to the soil itself. Beyond this, there were countless boon works, extra tasks imposed when the lord required. A peasant could be called away from their own pressing labors to repair a bridge, dig a ditch, or haul timber from a distant wood. At times, they were required to cart the lord's grain to market, drive his sheep to pasture, or maintain the very roads that linked the manor to the outside world. The work was endless, and the sense of obligation inescapable. Rents, dues, and payments. Labor was only one side of the peasant's burden. The other was rent, and it came in many forms. Few peasants handled money directly, for coinage was scarce in the countryside. Instead, their rent was extracted in kind, in chickens, eggs, cheese, firewood, or a share of grain. A peasant might be required to deliver a set number of hens each year, or a portion of every piglet born to his sty. Others owed Harriet, a grim inheritance tax in which the lord claimed the best animal when a tenant died. Even death did not free a peasant household from the lord's grasp. Markets and mills were further avenues of obligation. Peasants were not free to grind their grain wherever they pleased. They were bound by law to use the lord's mill, paying a fee, often 1/16 of their flour, for the privilege. The same was true of ovens and winepresses. Each necessity of life was an opportunity for the lord to reinforce his control and extract wealth. Even marriage carried a price. A serf who wished to marry outside the manor had to purchase the lord's permission, for to leave was to reduce the labor force bound to the land. In these ways, every major event of a peasant's life, birth, marriage, inheritance, and death, was shadowed by the obligations of feudalism. Protection and power. Despite the heavy burdens, peasants rarely rebelled outright. The feudal system was deeply entrenched, and though exploitative, it also offered a form of order in a world where chaos was never far away. The lord's manor was not only a symbol of domination but also of security. In times of war, peasants could shelter behind its walls. In times of famine, the lord might provide grain, not out of kindness, but to preserve the workforce that sustained him. When bandits prowled the countryside, the manor became a beacon of stability. Peasants often viewed their lord with a mix of resentment and dependence. He was both oppressor and protector, distant yet inescapably present in every furrow of the field, and every crumb of bread baked in the hearth. The weight of custom. Perhaps most striking was the way obligation was woven into the very culture of medieval life. It was not seen as a contract to be negotiated, but as a custom handed down from generations. A peasant did not question why he must give up half his harvest. It was the way things had always been. On feast days, peasants gathered in the village church and heard sermons that reinforced this order. Priests reminded them that God had placed everyone in their station, king, lord, priest, and peasant, and that obedience was both a social and spiritual duty. To resist one's lord was to resist the divine order itself. This ideology helped to cement the feudal system in place. Even when burdens grew unbearable, peasants more often appealed to tradition than to rebellion. They might argue that a lord had violated custom, but seldom that the system itself was unjust. Moments of resistance. And yet, resistance did exist. Records tell of peasants who fled their manors, vanishing into distant towns where freedom might be claimed after a year and a day of residency. Others banded together to petition against unfair dues or excessive labor. On rare occasions, entire villages rose in revolt, their torches and pitchforks a reminder that even the most downtrodden could be pushed too far. The most famous of these uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, revealed the simmering discontent that underlay centuries of obligation. Though most revolts were brutally crushed, they exposed the fragility of a system that relied so heavily on the compliance of the many for the benefit of the few. The daily reality. For the average medieval peasant, however, rebellion was a distant dream. The daily reality was one of toil, payment, and submission. As the seasons turned, so too did the cycle of duties: spring plowing for the Lord, summer haymaking on his fields, autumn harvests delivered into his barns, winter days repairing his roads and hedges. Each sunrise carried a silent reminder that their sweat and their labor nourished not only their families but also the manor above them. The feudal system was both the structure that bound them and the weight that pressed upon their backs. Closing reflection. The feudal system, with its intricate ties of obligation, was not simply a political framework. It was the lived experience of millions of peasants across medieval Europe. To modern eyes, it seems unbearably oppressive, a life of servitude and dependency. Yet to those who lived it, it was also stability, protection, and the unquestioned order of the world. The peasants' lives were shaped, constrained, and often crushed beneath this system, yet they endured. Through generations of labor and hardship, they sustained not only their lords, but the entire fabric of medieval society. Chapter 8. Festivals and Holy Days. Life in the medieval village was not only work and obligation. Though peasants toiled endlessly in the fields and on their lords' lands, there were moments of relief, joy, and togetherness. These moments came with the rhythm of the church calendar, a cycle of holy days, feasts, and festivals that punctuated the year with celebration. To the medieval peasant, time itself was shaped by the church. While the Lord ruled the land, the priests ruled the soul, and through the rhythm of holy days, peasants were reminded of salvation, sacrifice, and community. The plow, the sickle, and the spinning wheel were set aside for days of rest, prayer, and festivity. The calendar of the sacred. The medieval year was filled with holy days, far more than the handful we observe today. In fact, there were dozens, even up to 80 or more days each year, when labor was forbidden or reduced in honor of saints, martyrs, or sacred mysteries. Sundays were the foundation of this cycle. Each week, the village gathered at church, its bells calling them from the fields. Beyond Sundays, there were feast days marking the lives of saints, such as Saint George, Saint Michael, and Saint Mary Magdalene. There were also the great holy seasons, Easter, Christmas, Pentecost, and the long weeks of Lent leading up to Easter, marked by fasting and restraint. For peasants, these days were both spiritual and practical. They offered rare breaks from toil, a chance to rest weary muscles and join neighbors in prayer and celebration. In a world where life was harsh and short, holy days gave meaning, structure, and joy. Christmas, a winter feast. Among the greatest feasts was Christmas, celebrated not in a single day, but as a season stretching 12 days long. The harshness of winter, when fields lay fallow and work was lighter, made Christmas a time of genuine festivity. Cottages were decorated with greenery, holly, ivy, and evergreen boughs, symbols of life persisting through the cold. Fires blazed warmly, and tables groaned beneath what food could be spared: roasted meats, pies, spiced cakes, and ale. For the poor, this was often the only time they tasted luxuries. Lords sometimes distributed alms, food, or drink to their tenants, a gesture meant both to display generosity and to reinforce loyalty. Carols were sung, dances performed, and games played by firelight. Yet, even in this joy, the sacredness of the season was never forgotten. Midnight Mass was the pinnacle of the celebration, when the entire village crowded into the small church, its flickering candles lighting faces uplifted in reverence for the birth of Christ. Easter, renewal and celebration. If Christmas was warmth and charity, Easter was triumph and renewal. After the long fasting of Lent, Easter erupted in feasting. Eggs, forbidden during Lent, returned as symbols of new life. Breads were baked with care, lamb was roasted where possible, and the table once again filled with ale and cheese. The church service at Easter was among the most dramatic of the year. The story of Christ's resurrection was proclaimed with music, incense, and ritual. For peasants, it was not only a spiritual mystery but also a mirror of the natural world around them. As Christ rose from the tomb, so too did the earth awaken from the long sleep of winter. Easter was also a time for community processions, mystery plays, and games in the village square. It was a season of both solemn devotion and unrestrained joy. Harvest festivals. While church feasts were universal across Christendom, many villages also held their own harvest celebrations. When the grain was gathered safely into the barns, a sigh of relief passed through the community. Famine always lurked close, and a poor harvest meant hunger. A good harvest, however, called for celebration. Villagers sometimes fashioned the last sheaf of wheat into a figure, the corn dolly, as a symbol of fertility and abundance. Songs were sung in the fields, and great communal meals were shared. Ale flowed freely, laughter echoed across the manor, and for a brief time, the burdens of obligation felt lighter. These harvest feasts often blended Christian prayers of thanksgiving with older, folk customs tied to the land itself. In them, we glimpsed the deep connection medieval peasants felt between the soil they tilled and the divine mysteries that governed their lives. May Day and folk traditions. Not all festivals were strictly church-bound. Some, like May Day, carried echoes of ancient pagan rites, though often baptized into Christian meaning. On May 1st, villagers rose at dawn to gather flowers and greenery. Maypoles were erected, tall and colorful, around which dances were performed. Young men and women celebrated fertility, love, and the renewal of nature. Songs were sung, garlands woven, and laughter filled the village square. Though sometimes frowned upon by stricter priests, these folk traditions endured. They brought vitality and joy into the cycle of the year, reminding peasants that beyond the church and the manor, there was still the earth, ancient and eternal. The role of the church. At the center of every holy day was the village church. It was not merely a place of worship, but the very heart of communal life. Its bells announced the hours of prayer, the call to Mass, the rhythm of fasts and feasts. Inside, flickering candlelight and painted saints reminded peasants of mysteries larger than themselves. The priest guided them through the calendar, instructing them when to fast, when to feast, when to pray, and when to rest. For the illiterate peasant, unable to read scripture, the festivals and holy days were living sermons, teaching faith through ritual, story, and shared experience. Moments of joy. For peasants, whose lives were defined by labor, holy days were more than religious obligations. They were moments of genuine joy. Children chased each other in village squares, clutching simple toys. Young people courted under watchful eyes, dances serving as opportunities for laughter and connection. Old men raised mugs of ale, telling stories of years long past. The festivals were reminders that life, though short and harsh, held beauty and celebration. They bound the community together, reinforcing ties of kinship and faith. Closing reflection. In the medieval village, the rhythm of life was not only one of work, but also of sacred time. Festivals and holy days offered pause, celebration, and meaning. They reminded peasants that while their labor fed their lords and sustained the manor, their souls were nourished by the cycle of prayer and joy. The peasant's world was small, bounded by the manor's fields and the church's walls. Yet through festivals, they touched the eternal, finding hope in the mysteries of faith and delight in the fleeting joys of community. The bells of the church marked their days, but the festivals gave those days color. In them, the medieval peasant found not only rest, but the assurance that life, even in its hardships, was worth celebrating. Chapter 9. The Role of the Church and Clergy. In the medieval world, the church was not simply a building in the village, it was the beating heart of society. For peasants, it was impossible to separate daily life from the presence of faith. The church dictated the rhythm of the year, shaped morality, explained natural disasters, and promised salvation in a world where life was short and often brutal. The village church. Every village, no matter how small, centered around its church. Built of stone or timber, it was usually the most solid building in the settlement. To the peasant, its high walls and ringing bell were more than a symbol of religion. They represented stability in a world of uncertainty. Inside, candles flickered against cold walls. The altar, crucifix, and colorful painted images gave peasants a glimpse of heaven, though few could read the Latin texts. Instead, they learned through sermons, stained glass, and ritual, which brought stories of Christ and the saints to life. The parish priest. The parish priest was the spiritual guide of the village. He baptized the newborn, blessed marriages, heard confessions, and gave last rites to the dying. He was also a bridge between the church hierarchy and ordinary people. Many priests were educated in Latin and law, yet they lived among peasants, sharing in their struggles, hearing their sins, and reminding them of both heaven's rewards and hell's punishments. To the medieval peasant, the priest was both a figure of comfort and fear, the man who held the keys to salvation. Tithes and obligations. The church demanded not only loyalty but also resources. Every peasant owed a tithe, 1/10 of their harvest or income, to the church. This could mean grain, livestock, or even labor. For families already struggling, the tithe was a heavy burden. Yet refusal was unthinkable, for it risked damnation and social disgrace. To the church, this wealth built cathedrals, funded monasteries, and ensured the power of bishops and popes reached even the smallest village. Monks and monasteries. Beyond the parish priest, the wider church world was filled with monks and nuns, who withdrew from society to live lives of prayer, discipline, and work. Monasteries were not only spiritual centers, but also hubs of learning, medicine, and charity. Some peasants might seek refuge there during famine, or beg for food at the gates. To the medieval villager, monks seemed otherworldly, men who had chosen to live apart from worldly struggles. Yet their presence reinforced the idea that the church was everywhere, from the smallest chapel to the grandest abbey. The church as law and order. The influence of the church was not confined to the soul. It shaped laws, judged disputes, and even settled conflicts between neighbors. To sin was not only to disobey God, but also to break the rules of the community. Fear of excommunication, being cut off from the church, was enough to terrify even nobles, let alone peasants. To be denied the sacraments was to be denied salvation itself. Hope and fear. For peasants, the church was both a source of comfort and control. It offered hope, the promise of eternal life, protection from demons, and guidance in times of crisis. But it also instilled fear of sin, of damnation, of punishment in hell. The bells that rang out across the fields were not just calls to prayer. They were reminders that every action, every choice, was watched not only by neighbors, but by God. Closing reflection. The church and its clergy were the great unifying force of the Middle Ages. For peasants, it gave structure to life, explained the mysteries of death, and bound the community together under faith. Whether through ritual, law, or simple presence, the church stood as a constant in a world where little else could be trusted to endure. Chapter 10. Superstition and Belief in the Supernatural. Life in the medieval village was not only ruled by lords and the church. It was also guided by belief in forces unseen. For peasants, the world was alive with spirits, omens, curses, and blessings. These beliefs were not separate from religion but often existed alongside it, woven into the fabric of daily life. A world of mystery. To the medieval peasant, the natural world was mysterious and frightening. The cause of illness, the reason behind storms, or the failure of crops were all questions without scientific answers. Instead, peasants turned to superstition and tradition. If a cow sickened, it might be the work of a witch. If a child fell ill, perhaps the evil eye had been cast upon them. If lightning struck the fields, it could be a punishment from God or a sign of demons lurking nearby. The world was full of meaning, and nothing happened by chance. Everyday superstitions. Simple acts carry great weight. Peasants might carry charms to ward off bad luck, such as pieces of iron, herbs, or carved symbols. Bread baked with a cross cut into its crust was believed to keep away evil spirits. A horseshoe hung above the door was thought to bring protection. Even the act of spitting 3 times, or whispering a prayer when passing a crossroads, was considered enough to keep misfortune at bay. These customs were rarely questioned. They were inherited from parents, whispered by neighbors, and shared across generations. Witches and magic. Fear of witchcraft ran deep. While the church taught that God and saints protected the faithful, villagers still believed in individuals who could wield dark powers. A neighbor who muttered under her breath, or a healer whose remedies failed, could quickly become the target of suspicion. If cattle died suddenly or milk soured overnight, whispers of witchcraft spread like fire. Yet not all magic was seen as evil. Wise women and village healers were respected for their knowledge of herbs and remedies. They were often the only source of medicine for miles. To the desperate peasant, a charm from a healer could mean the difference between life and death. The supernatural landscape. The medieval countryside was thought to be filled with unseen beings. Fairies, spirits, and demons were believed to dwell in forests, rivers, and abandoned ruins. Children were warned not to wander into the woods at night, for fear of being stolen by spirits. Strange lights in the sky, eerie sounds in the night, or the sudden chill of wind were all interpreted as signs of supernatural presence. To the peasant, the world was never empty. It was crowded with forces just beyond sight. Omens and signs. Dreams were powerful, and a single image could be read as a prophecy. A crow circling above the fields might warn of death. A broken mirror, though rare in poor homes, was thought to bring years of bad luck. The changing of the seasons, the shape of the moon, and even the behavior of animals were all carefully watched for signs of the future. In a life filled with uncertainty, omens gave peasants a way to explain what lay ahead. The blending of faith and folklore. Though the church condemned superstition, in practice, peasants often blended Christian faith with older beliefs. A prayer to the Virgin Mary might be followed by the placing of a protective charm. A feast day might coincide with an older harvest ritual. This blending of faith and folklore created a unique world where saints, spirits, angels, and fairies could all exist side by side. Closing reflection. Superstition was not foolishness to the medieval peasant, it was survival. In a world without science, without certainty, these beliefs offered explanations and protection. Every shadow, every sound in the night, every twist of fate carried meaning. And though centuries have passed, these superstitions remind us of a time when the line between the natural and supernatural was far thinner than it is today. Chapter 11: Food, Famine, and Survival. For peasants in the medieval world, life revolved around one central concern: food. Securing enough to eat was not just a daily task but the struggle that defined existence. Every season, every harvest, every breath of the wind could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The peasant diet. The daily diet of a medieval peasant was simple, repetitive, and rarely indulgent. Bread was the staple, coarse, heavy loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the grain of the rich, was often out of reach. With bread came pottage, a thick stew of peas, beans, and whatever vegetables could be gathered from the fields or garden. On better days, scraps of bacon or a bone for flavor might find their way into the pot. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days or special occasions, unless a family had access to small game like rabbits or pigeons. Milk, cheese, and eggs provided some variety, though these were often too valuable to consume regularly. Better sold or traded for necessities. Ale, weak and watered down, was the common drink, safer than untreated water from rivers or wells. It was not a diet of luxury, but one designed to keep a body working in the fields. The risk of hunger. Despite all their labor, peasants lived under constant threat of hunger. A bad harvest could leave a village in ruin. Too much rain, too little sun, or an outbreak of disease among crops or livestock could strip a family of food for months. Famine was never far away. In years of scarcity, villagers turned to desperate measures, stretching flour with acorns or weeds, boiling nettles into soups, or eating spoiled grain that carried sickness. Hunger was not only painful but humiliating, a reminder that no matter how hard one worked, survival was never guaranteed. The feudal burden. The struggle for food was made worse by the demands of the feudal system. Lords required rents and tithes, often in grain or livestock. The church demanded its tenth, even when peasants themselves went without. In good years, these dues were a burden. In bad years, they were a sentence. Families sometimes starved while barns belonging to the nobility remained stocked. The unfairness was clear, but peasants had little power to resist. Harvest and community. When the harvest came, it was not just work, it was a matter of life and death. Entire villages toiled from dawn until dusk, cutting, threshing, and storing grain. Failure to gather the harvest in time could mean disaster if rains spoiled the crop. Harvest was also a communal affair. Songs were sung, and shared meals were eaten in the fields. For a brief moment, there was unity in purpose. And when the barns were finally filled, the village celebrated with feasts and fairs, a temporary escape from the constant shadow of hunger. Times of plenty. In rare years of abundance, peasants might enjoy foods otherwise out of reach. Fresh fruits from orchards, nuts gathered from the woods, or honey from village hives offered sweetness in a life often lacking it. Festivals brought roasted meats, pies, and stronger ale. These were moments of joy, when the harshness of life seemed to soften, and families could laugh and feast as though the struggles of winter did not exist. The cruelty of famine. But abundance was fleeting, and famine always returned. In the early 14th century, Europe was struck by the Great Famine, when cold, wet summers ruined harvests for years in a row. Entire villages starved. Children were abandoned. Rumors of cannibalism spread. Such events left scars on communities for generations. They shaped the way peasants thought, prayed, and worked, always fearing the next disaster. Hunger was the enemy that could never be defeated, only endured. Coping and survival. Peasants developed ways to endure lean times. Food was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying. Roots and herbs were foraged from hedgerows. Villagers relied on one another, sharing when possible, though desperation sometimes bred theft and conflict. For the peasant, survival meant resilience, finding ways to endure hunger while never losing hope that the next harvest would be kinder. Closing reflection. Food, famine, and survival were the rhythm of medieval peasant life. Every day began with hunger, and ended with the hope of fullness. It was a fragile existence, one bound tightly to the soil, the weather, and the will of forces beyond their control. To understand the medieval peasant is to understand this eternal struggle, the fight not for wealth or glory, but for the most basic of human needs, to eat, and to live another day. Chapter 12: Clothing, Shelter, and Daily Comforts. If food was the heartbeat of peasant survival, Then clothing and shelter were the skin and bones that held daily life together. For peasants in the medieval world, what you wore and where you lived revealed not only your place in society, but also the limits of your survival. The peasant's clothing. Peasant clothing was not designed for fashion. It was practical, rugged, and intended to endure the rigors of fieldwork. Men typically wore tunics made of rough wool or linen, belted at the waist. Beneath, simple trousers or leggings were tied with cords. Their feet were often wrapped in leather shoes or, for the poorest, nothing at all. In colder months, cloaks or patched coats were layered over, sometimes lined with sheepskin for warmth. Women's clothing consisted of long woolen dresses, often layered with aprons. A head covering, a wimple or simple cloth veil, was nearly universal, both as a sign of modesty and a way to shield from the elements. Colors were limited. Most garments were undyed or muted shades of brown, gray, and green. Brighter colors, costly dyes, and decorated fabrics were luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Yet, during festivals or holy days, some peasants might wear their best clothing, slightly finer tunics or dresses, carefully preserved for years. Clothing for peasants was patched, repaired, and handed down through generations. A single tunic might serve a man for a decade, growing threadbare but still serviceable. To waste cloth was unthinkable. Shelter, the peasant's home. The average peasant family lived in a crude, one-room hut, sometimes shared with livestock. These homes, called crock houses or cottages, were built with timber frames, wattle and daub walls, and thatched roofs. Inside, the floor was often bare earth. A hearth in the center of the room provided heat and a place to cook, though the smoke escaped only through a hole in the roof or gaps in the thatch. This left the interior dark, smoky, and harsh on the lungs. Beds, if they could be called that, were straw mattresses laid on wooden frames, shared by the entire family. Livestock might sleep under the same roof, providing warmth in the winter but also filth and disease. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a rough wooden table, stools, and a chest for storage. Despite these hardships, the peasant home was a place of family and community. Its simplicity reflected necessity, but within its walls, life unfolded, meals were shared, children were raised, and stories were told by firelight. Daily comforts. Comfort was rare, but peasants found small ways to ease the strain of life. Warmth came from the fire, though fuel, wood or peat, was precious and often scarce. Herbs and flowers, gathered from fields, sometimes hung from rafters to freshen the smoky air or ward off pests. Straw was renewed on the floor to keep dampness at bay. Entertainment came in the form of storytelling, singing, or playing simple instruments. Village gatherings and festivals offered joy beyond the toil of daily labor. Even in poverty, laughter and music found their place. Clothing as a social marker. It is worth noting that clothing also marked status. A peasant's coarse wool tunic stood in stark contrast to the silks, velvets, and furs of the nobility. Laws known as sumptuary laws even dictated what peasants could and could not wear, preventing them from imitating the styles of the wealthy. Thus, clothing was more than fabric. It was a symbol, a visual reminder of where one stood in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. Shelter as a reflection of struggle. Just as clothing marked status, the peasant's humble cottage revealed the struggles of their existence. Fragile against storms, vulnerable to fire, and plagued by smoke and dampness, it was far from the grand stone halls of lords and castles. Yet within these simple huts, peasants forged lives of resilience. Their cottages may have lacked beauty, but they held warmth, family, and the strength of survival. Closing reflection. For peasants, clothing and shelter were never luxuries. They were the bare minimum, the fragile armor against a harsh and unforgiving world. Though poor in possessions, the peasant's life was rich in endurance, shaped by the daily act of making do with little. In their patched tunics and smoky cottages, peasants carried on, sustained not by comfort but by necessity, and by the unyielding human spirit that refuses to give in, even in the hardest of times. Peasant farmers relied on simple, often handmade tools. Plows, usually made of wood with an iron tip, pulled by oxen. They turned the soil but were far less efficient than the heavy plows used in richer regions. Sickles and scythes, essential for cutting grain and grass. Flails, used for threshing, separating grain from husks. Hoes and spades, for small-scale digging, planting, and maintenance. These tools were primitive by modern standards, yet they were vital. A broken plow or lost ox could devastate a family's livelihood. The burden of labor. Peasant labor was relentless. Most peasants worked 6 days a week, from first light until dusk. Sundays and holy days offered respite, though often these were spent in church, not leisure. Men bore the heaviest burdens of plowing and harvesting, but women labored alongside them. Women sowed seeds, tended gardens, gathered firewood, fetched water, spun wool, and cared for children. In truth, peasant women worked as much as men, and often more. Children, too, played their part. From as young as 5 or 6, they herded geese, carried water, or chased birds from the fields. By their early teens, they were expected to work alongside adults. Childhood, as we know it today, scarcely existed. Risks and hardships. The life of a peasant farmer was fraught with risk. Drought, floods, hailstorms, or infestations of locusts could wipe out an entire harvest. Disease among oxen could leave fields unplowed. Even in good years, yields were small compared to modern farming. A family might harvest only 3 or 4 grains for every one planted, a fragile margin that left little room for error. Hunger and famine were constant threats. A poor harvest meant hunger in the winter. A second poor harvest could spell disaster for entire villages. In such times, peasants resorted to eating acorns, nettles, or even bark from trees to survive. The feudal burden. Adding to the hardship was the feudal system. Peasants did not farm solely for themselves. Much of what they produced was owed to the lord of the manor as rent or tax. A portion went to the church as tithes. Only what remained sustained the peasant's own family. Thus, the very soil that peasants worked with their sweat and blood did not truly belong to them. They were laborers on land they could never own, forever trapped in a cycle of toil and obligation. Closing reflection. In the end, the fields defined the medieval peasant. They were the source of life, the measure of hardship, and the stage on which each generation's survival was fought. To work the land was exhausting and often thankless, but it bound peasants to a rhythm older than memory itself, the eternal cycle of sowing and reaping, of hunger and hope, of life wrestled from the earth by the strength of their hands.